I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Lapidus. Many of you know her already. Jennifer and I go back about 14 years. When I first moved to Charlotte, she helped create the Asheville Bread Festival and had her own bakery at the time, and we became friends from that point on. I featured her in one of my books about whole grain baking because at that time she was making some of the most phenomenal Daysum sourdough, speaking of sourdough, Daysum sourdough breads. And what really impressed me about Jennifer then is she built her own oven. She'd get up and chop her own wood. She ground her own grain. It was all fresh ground grain. Is Paul here? Paul needs to hear that. And then she'd get up, bake the breads, take her daughter to school, come back. It was like an amazing thing that she did until I guess you probably at some point you had to go enough's enough. And so she got into something less stressful. Right now she's a miller, and has created Carolina Ground, which is again part of a growing movement around the country of small artisan mills that are doing something very, very special. And I'll let her tell you all about that. Jennifer, it's all yours.
Do I use
your
it?
mic up.
Okay, and my mic. Oh. Sorry, I need to start the timer. Okay. Hi. So, yes, Jennifer Lapidus. I am really glad to be here today to talk to you all. I'm so excited about actually even beginning with the director speaking, because I didn't expect to be so inspired by all the messages coming through. And I feel like the speaker before really set the stage for me. So thank you for that, historically speaking. I want to talk to you today about where I hope to see the industry heading. I think it is heading slowly in this direction, but I want to, and the title of the talk really gives it away, Baker at the Helm. So, as we move forward as bakers and as an industry, I thought I could demonstrate my vision by telling you a little about how I got here, how we got here, but specifically how I got here. Because it's a little amazing that you guys even let me in the door. And, because, I baked my first loaf of bread in 1990, actually, with my mother's copy of Beard on Bread. There wasn't that many titles to go from back in 1990. And I segued from Beard on Bread to Tassajara Bread Book. I imagine most of you know Tassajara is put out by, I know you do, put out by a Zen student in Monterey County doing whole grain yeasted breads. And from there I went to Uprisings. So I was an avid home baker. I was just baking at home. And I went to Uprisings, which was a book put out by an organization called the Whole Grain Bakers Association. And it was, so this was pre-Whole Grain Council. This was actually a group of like renegade bakers nationwide they were either collectively owned or cooperatively owned, and they were doing whole grain baking. Remember one of the bakeries in the book, Rebel Grains, like I met them at this gathering I went to, and they didn't have a bakery anymore because they were too outside the box to actually have a business, and but it was, I was really drawn to that, and but with each bake, there was something about bread really that drew me in, and with each bake I was drawn in more, and for me, I was actually a history major in college, and I was still a student at this time, and with each bake, I was drawn more, and it was like a visceral attraction to a time that I didn't live in, and a way of doing things that was not what I was, seeing in the world. I saw a story there and a history of this different time, and I was drawn in. And with each bake, too, I would look at these rapid rise yeast packets, and I was curious about it, because again, this was the early 90s, so what we're getting here in the room is amazing, but there's no World Wide Web. The baking books were not talking about sourdough that I was finding, and I didn't know it existed, or what that even was, but I would look at these rapid rise yeast packets, and I figured there was probably a less rapid way of doing this, if they were boasting rapid. I mean, I'm I'm Jewish, it seems like if rapid rise yeast was around back in the day that I wouldn't have been eating matzah a few weeks ago. So I knew that there was probably a different way of doing this, but I didn't know how to get there. And so I had this curiosity, and I also, apropos to that segue from Beard on Bread to Tassajara and uprisings was this sort of hippie lifestyle I was cultivating. And so it was in that realm, because as the speaker before us, explained how our bread had transformed. This was not out and easy to find. And it was in that very fringe, obscure place that I found the clue to what came before in bread's story. I was working on a biodynamic farm in Blairsville, Georgia, and it was in a biodynamic journal that I found an article called The Art of Natural Baking. It was an interview with Richard Bourdon of Berkshire Mountain Bakery, and I read the first line, which was, before the art of baking joined forces with the brewing industry. And I knew I had landed on something. Like this was what I had been looking for. And so I'm going to just read from that. It said, the baker would assemble his commonplace ingredients on the stage, simple things the peasants knew quite well, like flour, water, and salt, mix them together and pull out something entirely different, something that could never have been predicted with those three humble ingredients. The author, Joel Morrow, goes on. He says, the taste had nothing to do with the floury, yeasty, grainy, adulterated product that has passed off as bread today, even in organic health food industry, even amongst dedicated small organic bakers. And so I read this, and it was a huge moment for me. I was now on a path. I was no longer going to be a home baker. I wanted to rediscover this bread. I wanted to bring this bread back. I needed to realize this, and I was actually also studying for the LSATs, and I threw that life aside, decided not to go to law school, and I secured 2 apprenticeships. And the apprenticeships that I secured are interesting historically because they do sort of represent this sort of wonky path that whole grain baking has taken. So, what that author was talking about, the organic breads and the health food stores and all of that, everybody knows or probably remembers the 1970s brown bread that was, left a bit to be desired. And my first apprenticeship was in Arkansas at one of the bakeries that was in that Uprisings cookbook. And we were doing naturally leavened bread. We were milling. We had 3 Meadows mills. And we were milling the flour, and we were making this bread. It was just wheat, water, sea salt. It was the whole process of making the culture was incredible to me. The stiff dough ball. The tradition is a Flemish naturally leavened bread called Dazem. And but we were making this bread, and we were making tofu, and we were making macrobiotic cookies and sauces and jams, and it was all, we were nitrogen packing the bread and vacuum packing, sending it off to health food stores in Oklahoma and Texas, and our focus was really broad, and our focus was also really specific. We were doing health food, and that was it. It was health food. It was very broad, and the bread wasn't good. I felt like our focus was way too. This wasn't it. And I learned a lot there, but I left that apprenticeship, and I went out to California, and I apprenticed with Alan Scott. And I remember walking into his house and to the back and to the kitchen, and there was this loaf of bread there, and it was like I had arrived. This bread had the perfect note of flavor. The bread I had experienced in Arkansas was sour. It was the baker. Sour on a level that just wasn't what I felt it should be, and the baker wasn't there focused on that. There was too much going on. But at Allen's, we were baking this bread in the wood-fired oven he'd built in the backyard, and everything rotated around bread. And it was like, this was it, these 3 simple ingredients that were elevated to, a level of sophistication. It had transcended, it had sort of this mired in health food, brown bread, 1970s. This was real food. And I was, this was it for me. So I apprenticed with Alan, and I eventually opened my own bakery. And the 3 components that I felt were essential for me to recreate this, as Peter was talking about, was the mill and the culture and the oven. So, and I created this life, and it was, let's see, so fast forward a little bit. That was in the early 90s, and I was one of the few people doing this kind of baking in the country. There was the stuff that Lionel was doing out in San Francisco, I think, at the same time. That was a little different, because I was, we were, those of us that were doing this sort of whole grain, naturally leavened, wood-fired oven baking, there was a lot of education that needed to happen in that realm, and I found myself doing hours of bread tastings, explaining to customers. I wasn't even something that I felt I needed to do. It was something I wanted to do. I was so excited about this bread. And I would talk to them, to the customer, about the phytic acid breakdown and the absorption of nutrients and like the pH. I had this whole spiel, and the customer just like needed to taste the bread because the taste spoke much louder, and they really just wanted to taste the bread. They did not want to hear me. But that was an interesting thing. You see, the bread, the taste of the bread was what sold it. And so anyways, by the early 2000s, as many of you must have seen, a wave of artisan baking, the renaissance of artisan baking, really took off nationwide. And folks like Lionel and Peter and, are so much the reason for it, for this nationwide movement and renaissance of artisan baking. A lot of publications started coming out that really offered the, from the avid home baker to the professional baker, a lot to go on, talking about fermentation and Jeffrey Hammelman and, Alan's book and Peter's books. And so I found myself in Western North Carolina a part of a rich baking community. And most of these bakers were not milling in-house, but they did have this. They were doing natural leavening or sponge or long, slow ferments. And we have, as Peter was saying, the Asheville Bread Fest, which really brought us all together as a community. So I'm going to get us to closer to the present, which is, and then 2008 happened. And along with the housing bubble, most of you must know, there was a rush on commodities and the price of wheat hit the roof. And it was a really profound moment for a lot of us bakers, because even though I was milling in-house and I felt that the components that were essential was that oven, the wood-fired oven and the mill and the culture, my grain was grown 1,000 miles from where I was baking my bread, and the equation started to change. We started talking about the farmer, miller, and baker, and what happened in Western North Carolina was a bunch of us pulled our chairs together and started talking about the idea of launching a mill to get a closer understanding of where our, who's growing our grain. And it sounded like a crazy idea, but we started talking about sustainability, both economic and environmental, reducing our food miles, hedging ourselves from commodity pricing, creating real pricing, looking at wheat as an agricultural product with geographic distinction and flavor. We chose stone over steel because if we're going to do this, close to home, why not elevate the grain through cold stone milling? And we launched the mill. I traded in my apron and headscarf for, as Peter said, for coveralls and a respirator, and led the charge. And I was not alone. There's plenty of, what was amazing was to see this roll out nationwide. And, we are part of a burgeoning movement from, New York really inspired me with their Farmer Ground. Carolina Ground the name is super inspired by them. Hayden Mills, Griston Toll in LA, Maine Grains up in Maine, Camas Country, and is it Oregon or Washington? I always get those two. Yeah, and then the other one that I can't see, but Barton Springs in Austin. And what I found, which has been really incredible, is offering our bakers flour that they hadn't had access to before, freshly cold stone milled, whole or bolted. And we've seen some really inspiring things happening in the bakeries. The bakers before this mill, they could interact with their flour in certain ways through their long, slow fermentation and conjure flavor. But what we were doing by offering them this fresh flour, cold stone milled, whole or bolted, was offering them a whole new set of a whole new palette of flavor to interact with. And it really saw a lot of inspiration coming from the bakeries. And most of these bakeries, we started with the western part of the state, but then it became a statewide, and now we see ourselves as the Southeast. We work with bakeries from far south as Miami up to Virginia and over to Mississippi and Louisiana, and most of them they replaced their whole grains with ours, and some of them created new products that would be just distinct of whether it was North Carolina or Southern. And so this is how they've interacted with our mill. For the mill itself, we do any opportunity to educate the customer as to what does this look like. That slide, okay, it looks better on this side. I'm like, that slide looks really, so educating, the fact that we had the bread festival that we still have, which is next weekend, by the way. Any opportunity that we have of interacting with our customer as to what these, what does it mean to, what does rye look like? What is, soft wheat versus hard wheat? And the various extractions, because our language is a little different with how we describe our flour. And what does it mean to remove 15 parts and it still contains the germ? So there's been a lot of education that's gone along with it on our part, but it's also been bringing there's John McDonald from Weaver Street and one of our growers in Wake County to meet the farmer. And here's me and Lionel and Billy Carter. And this is really especially great because Billy Carter grew the rye in the bread that's being passed around. And that's in Moore County, which is Eagle Springs, which is like probably an hour from here. And he's a large-scale organic grower. Part of the piece with the mill is, we were going to create a market for our large-scale organic growers in the South. So there's me and Tor Oshner, who's a farmer he's part of Farmer Ground Mill, and so it's not just here. It's a nationwide network. It's actually outside of our borders. My daughter lives in London, and in her food share that she gets, she has the opportunity to get flour that way too, which is really neat. Very similar mill to ours. There's more farmers because you can't get too many farmers in the pictures, right? So we also, with this project, have a wheat breeder based in Raleigh, USDA-ARS, like Steve Jones, who was up earlier. Dr. Marshall is a public wheat breeder. And when he started out, he was breeding for performance in the field and in the bakery. But now he's actually breeding for flavor as well. And Lionel and I worked with Dr. Marshall on I think it was last year or the year before, where we had varieties that he was thinking about releasing, and La Farm did a bake where we could bake, we did the milling of all of these grains, whole grain and sifted, and then they did bakes, and we could stand around and taste this stuff. And so that's been, an evolution that has happened through this project. And we've also engaged with, well, there's Jeffrey Yankala, this is Bread Festival, but, working with our flour and making laminate doughs with a high extraction flour, so we're only removing 15 parts. And there's Richard Miskovich making a miche with our flour. So, we're engaged with the culinary world. And what I want to say about all of that, when the mill happened, it was like this democratizing force, because the reason I tell you partly of where I came from as a baker and why I say it's amazing that you let me in the door is that I was on the kind of fringe of baking. The bakers community in Western North Carolina, we're a wonderful community, and we were all real supportive of each other, but I couldn't believe they were following me with this idea, because I knew what they thought about my bakery. Oh, she makes good bread, but it's crazy. She's out there cutting her wood and, and raising her daughter, and it was insane. And it was crazy. But, I was burnt out after 14 years of doing it. But with the mill, it has brought in everybody. It has brought in the culinary world that when, Lionel and his tribe were doing, come on, Lionel, help me out for a second, San Francisco Baking Institute. Yeah, and that world and this very fringe Alan Scott world, we're all sharing and growing together as bakers through these regional mills. The flours engage on flavor and sometimes in extraordinary ways in performance, but also sometimes in ways that are challenging. And it commands a bit more from the baker. For us on the mill end, we're looking at, just as the breeder is looking at flavor, we too are looking at flavor. So here's I was doing Hamantaschen, and I looked at our 2 different siftings of our rye, and then an AP. I've been working on this high extraction all-purpose flour because, as you may have seen in my abstract, the bakers have done a lot, and we've come a long way, but we're now into year 6, and I feel like it's time for us to push forward beyond where we are right now. And there's certain bakers that are really sort of leading the charge, and I keep throwing out La Farm because I think it comes hand in hand with being a master baker, that he's going to be educating and pushing these things forward. And but the piece that I feel needs to sort of shift in the big picture is that the bakers replace their flour with whole grain flours. They may have created a new product, but are we going to just continue what we were baking before this regional grains movement happened and just do it a little better? Because that's what's happening. They're doing it better than they were before, and it's so extraordinary. But what is it going to take us a little bit further than that, beyond making what we were already doing a little better, but actually plowing forward? And I think this sort of no man's land is, or like this area that I feel like has such potential, is farm to pastry. Looking at our pastry flours, because the bakers come with all of this skill on the bread end and have been engaging and working with challenging stuff. And then we have this, North Carolina, for example, grows more soft wheat than any other southern state. We do this really well. And so when I first started out with this project, I'm like, pastry schmastry, I'm a bread baker. But I brought in an apprentice from Johnson & Wales, and I was like, well, she came to me, and I was like, okay, why don't you just look at our pastry flours? Because I don't know a lot about pastry flours, and I want you to explore this. Why don't we do a pâte brisée and pâte sucrée with each one? So we did this project, and we had the whole wheat, 100% extraction, whole wheat. Wheat in, flour out. 85, which is our high extraction, 15 parts removed. Our 75, and then our crema, which is, like the lightest of what we do, and an embarrassing level of what goes out. And what we found was really exciting to us because we were exploring not just the performance, we're exploring the flavor piece, and we're exploring the application, because once we got wowed by the flavor, we wanted to know, what can we do with this? Like whole wheat pastry, for example, I thought, who would want whole wheat pastry? But then when we did the pâte sucrée or pâte brisée, both of them, they were kind of the same, whether they had sugar or no sugar, in terms of whether they layered up or not, whether they opened up. But the flavor coming through was so interesting and unexpected in that application. And
Jen, can I just
Yeah.
throw in a question and a comment? The baskets that are passing that started on this side are different from the ones that were on that side. So if you've got some bread from that side and pass them over here when you're done, and you guys pass those baskets over there, and then while you're describing.
Yeah, and it's good that you mentioned that. Yeah, because the reason we're passing the baskets, and in the perfect world, we're like, and now taste this stuff, but we wanted to get you guys, get that stuff out there. So what we have in the baskets both is La Farm's Scandinavian rye and ridiculous Pop-Tarts, and his chocolate rye cookies, which are also insane. And then I did a bunch of just simple salted butter cookies. There are some roller milled flour in there too, which is pretty obvious, because they're the ones that look perfect. Which I gotta say, like, I was baking yesterday, and I was in a kitchen with an oven that I hadn't used before. That was we're actually gutting our kitchen next week, and this oven is going out the door. But the oven was all over the place with temperature. It was crazy. But these guys did great. Not my stuff. My stuff, I was like, oh God, the heat flies up, and it was too striking, and the butter, and which was, so I can understand why these guys work so well in a bakery. And yet I wanted to pass this stuff around. Some of them are whole rye, some of them are whole wheat, Some of them are high extraction rye, and some of them are high extraction wheat. So again, 15 parts removed, whether it was rye or wheat, and then there's the roller milled product. And okay, I'm jumping around a little bit. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that this was coming next. I'm going to come back to that slide and go to here because we're already on there, and then I'll just go back. That crema, which is not what you're tasting, but when I was showing you that slide of the last one, the one that I'm embarrassed about how much goes out the door, I almost wanted to kind of stop doing that flour because I felt like roller mills could do it better. Roller mills are incredibly efficient and incredibly functional flour, and it served a really good purpose in terms of feeding the world. And I don't think that we're going to replace the roller mill here. That is not. I think that would be, that is not the plan. But I didn't know if I should be doing a flour like what we were doing, this crema. And so I got my apprentice to do. We had been doing simple cakes too, and I was like, why don't you do one with the roller milled flour so that I can see the difference? Because I fully believe that the roller milled flour was going to be much better than our crema. You know, I mean, this is what they do well. But this is what I came up with, which was really interesting. So as you can see on the right hand, the one that's bigger, I think it's your right, like, is our crema. And the other one is a roller milled AP flour, a good quality roller milled AP flour. If I was going to make a wedding cake, that is what I would use. But we did this, and it was like, okay, we need to make this flour, and because the vibrance and the flavor that was coming through, we were floored, and it was very unexpected. Oh, wait, I went too far. I want to go back to this. So what La Farm has done, and La Farm is an example for us here in this part of the country, but this is happening in other parts of the country as well. But for me, it's like we work with growers, and there's like a certain kind of grower that wants to go beyond just growing the grain. And I find that with the bakers too, that there's a lot of bakers who are just so busy with the production making, that's what they're doing. But then there's that baker that really wants to push it a little further. And what La Farm is doing, which I'm really excited about, is they've got this quarterly focus on grain, because part of what they're doing is trying to educate their customers as to what does flavor mean in terms of baked goods. You know, not just if we're going to do pastry, let's not just be tasting butter and eggs, but what about engaging with the flour as well? And if we're doing bread. So what they did last quarter was a focus on rye, and they did 2 breads and 2 pastries. And my concept of, baker at the helm, it's the first speaker was speaking about how if the consumer is willing to pay the price, then they'll buy the product. And I feel like, I know as a baker, that there's a lot of feeling that maybe the consumer doesn't want brown bread or brown pastry. Maybe the consumer wants white bread because that's what they buy the most of. But the things that we've observed through this project, one, it launched pretty much in 2008 when we were all stunned by the price of wheat hitting the roof. Another thing that happened in 2008 was the discovery that the demand for local is recession-proof. It was the one thing that continued to grow. And along with that demand for local is a demand for, transparency and understanding of where one's food comes from, and a curiosity. And I think that that's where the baker really has a huge potential, because you can speak. I mean, we have so much at our fingertips now. A number of publications that are out now blows my mind. I mean, from the tartine books to sourdough to, Stanley's amazing book on rye. I mean, there's so much information out there now than there was when I started as a baker. And we have the breeders on our sides, and we have the teaching folks on our sides, and we have an engaged audience. We have customers that I think do want this. And I think that it really takes just a little bit more to engage the baker. What La Farm is doing with their focus on a grain, I think this quarter they're on einkorn, yeah, and they know they've done polenta, the corn, right? Haven't they done? You guys are a really engaging audience here. Okay, just out here by myself, and okay. One more slide, and I'm good. And another thing that's going on in California, they've got the grain campaign. They have this 20% by 2020 where they want to see the people, bakeries across the board using 20% local grains. This all was inspired by June Russell in New York at the Greens Market, largest farmers market in the nation, requiring 15% New York grain. All of that is coming from, the June Russell piece came from industry saying, bakers, we need you to do this. But I'm saying, bakers, don't, and maybe you're not in an audience of bakers, but if you are, I do feel that it is a huge opportunity. And the first time, I think, the history that I've seen where the baker really can guide this ship in the direction that, if we're engaging more with whole grains and our baking on a level of sophistication, on real food, not health food, but at a place that tastes really good. Do you guys like what you're tasting? Yeah, okay, good. Whew. And my last slide, this is our crema rye with mascarpone cheese and lemon curd that was a mistake in the mill room. We sifted rye by mistake, so we took it home and baked with it, because this is what you do when you have a mill and you don't know what else to do with it. And this last picture I leave you is my daughter in front of the oven. And the reason I say that, too, is because back then, when I was doing my baking, it was okay to exist in a vacuum. I had like 5 cultures. I had started my wheat culture and then my craft rye culture, rye flour culture, spelt, kamut. I was engaging with this equation that I'd created. I was talking to my customers. It was a community effort. But now it's like a much larger thing. It's a nationwide movement. It's a worldwide movement to bring sustainable food systems back, regional production of grain, engagement with our farmer, transparency, single variety. And I think that it's in our hands as bakers to move this forward. And those of you that are maybe not bakers but are consumers, ask this of your baker too. Tell them that you want to engage with flavor beyond, like this. So, anyways. Have I left any time for questions?
Well, I think we have a little bit of time. So what we're going to do, I know Jennifer wanted to try to make this more of a conversation, and as well as in using her presentation as a launching pad, really, because I think what you're talking about really raises the question about relationship. And it's all, and I think this is all about the relationship. By the way, she mentioned Lionel. Not most of you know Lionel, but for those who don't, Lionel Vatanet, would you mind just standing up and just letting everybody see you there? He baked a lot of these breads. His bakery, La Farm, in Cary, North Carolina, about 2 hours from here, is really a landmark bakery for. It's in the nation's top bakeries, but also for North Carolina, really important bakery, and he's helping to pave the way for this kind of relationship that we're talking about.
One other thing I want to say about La Farm that was distinctly different from the other bakeries that came is, as part of this group of bakeries, we launched this mill. La Farm wasn't part of that group, and they came to us as we started this mill for a different reason. They came to us because Lionel, as you may have noticed, is from France, and so, he was really excited to have a mill that he can engage with on this level. And so, that has been a really distinctive piece because the price of wheat is no longer, we're not experiencing the same discomfort that we were experiencing in 2008. So for him, it was more of an opportunity to engage with the mill and engage with flavor and see where we could move forward with this. And I think that that's why also he's real helpful for us to push this forward because, we have this sort of a great relationship with not only the bakery, but bringing us all onto the farm end. And so.
Well, and I think, just so you know, it's not just questions. If you have comments, we want comments as well because we want to get a conversation going. And this conversation we got about 10 more minutes that we can carry it on here and then continue it out there. But we'd like to get the conversation going because, Nathan raised the question, really, what's a loaf of bread worth? This presentation talks about, you know, this other end of the spectrum that justifies, you know, a higher price bread for those who are in a position and willing to recognize what goes into the cost of a loaf of bread and the value added components. So what do you think about that? I mean, we have people from all aspects of the industry. Remember that this audience here is pretty much, you know, sort of focused in a few areas, but we've got lots of people who will be watching these on YouTube in the future. A lot of them will be up and coming bakers, people that are new to the industry, students perhaps, people from all walks of life. So there's nothing that's too elemental here. I mean, we can get as basic or as advanced as we want to, because people of all types will be watching. So any comments or thoughts? Yes, I'm going to pass the mic up so I don't have to walk up all those steps.
You mentioned high extraction, and I don't understand. I'm not familiar with what your extraction
Okay.
is.
Yeah, so if we look at, and that even in of itself is a piece, is educating of what the flours, and so 100% whole grain is 100% extraction. So the high extraction is once we've started sifting, the most that is there. So, you know, our high extraction is 15 parts larger bran removed, everything else there. And when you're stone grinding, it's a whole, it's the grain in, grain out, so no separation up, so the germ still exists, and you're just sifting off the, you know, and yeah.
White flour is what?
70?
60?
65?
60, 65.
Look
So.
at the size of the.
Yeah. You've
But
thrown away
it's different.
35% of what's in the grain. That's
Yeah.
what it's saying. How much of what nature gave you in a whole kernel have you kept in your flour?
And
Or
we-
actually have you taken out?
Can you repeat
Yeah, and
that?
we get,
kept-
I'm sorry?
Repeat what you just said. Or because we didn't have the mic on.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a layman, but my explanation to myself is that that extraction number, it tells you of the whole kernel that you had when you started your milling process into your flour has gone what percentage of the weight of those kernels. That's
Yeah.
all that number means, correct?
Well, I would add that it's also the softer parts of the grain tend to come out first.
They're heaviest.
So basically, you're getting, with the lower extraction, the 70, 75, 65, you're getting more endosperm.
Right.
With the higher extractions, you're getting more of the outer layers,
Yeah.
which have more of the fat, protein, and fiber.
Yeah, but I think Jennifer's saying that versus, say, a roller mill process, when we're talking about wheat, the stone mill process is actually having the lipids from the germ bleed into the endosperm, so that's included where it wouldn't be in a roller milled.
Right, but in a white roller mill, you're still, I think, 60 to 65. Is it? Or is it 70?
A lot of the good stuff is thrown away.
Yeah.
Jennifer, first of all, thanks for the presentation. Quick question. It's impossible not to see the the excitement that's coming around with the artisan bakeries, not to be synonymous with kind of the crafted brewing industry that's kind of exploded. Are we heading towards that point where we will look at local breweries and local bakeries the same way?
In terms of ubiquitous, or?
In regards to its commonality, sure.
You know, it's interesting to say that because I still don't feel like, I mean, it's easy to find really good bread unless you're, I mean, I will grab onto your comparison, one, to say that in this country, we don't have traditions like in France or in Belgium or whatnot. And I see that although we don't have a tradition in whole grain baking like a Volkenbrot or a Dasum or whatnot, we do have a lot of opportunity with that. We didn't have that tradition in brewing, and look what happened. And I see it as an opportunity for us to really push this forward. But I just don't think that we're even close to it with the bakeries, personally. Yeah. I mean, and the bakeries that we work with are not necessarily what you're going to find on the grocery store shelf. What really works with the kind of bread, flours that we're doing is to be able to tell the story. And so being able to sell at farmers market or have brick and mortar is super useful to be able to tell the story.
Hi, this is kind of just a comment onto what he's saying. I'm from Arizona, and we have Hayden Mills flour.
Yes.
And we have several new breweries and distillers that are, going crazy. And it's been pretty amazing because I've met and tasted and then saved mash from them and then use that as porridge breads, but then highlight the flours from Hayden Mills in it. And it's been a way for me to add on value by saying I'm using Hayden Mills flour, but people are paying for it because it has the distillery mash in it, because alcohol people will pay for. But, and once I add the bread component, it makes Hayden Mills more visible. So thank you.
Good comment. Do you want to add to that? Go ahead. I'll get you there.
I really don't want to add to that, but I want to ask is how are you going to make these breads available to lower income people?
Right. It's a really good point, and I wish I had kind of recorded what my daughter said when she asked about the mill, because she was young enough to be like, oh, she's sort of something like, oh, now you're going to do flour that's for rich people as opposed to the bread. But, personally, the lens that I see it through, for one, is creating a market, a much richer market for our large-scale organic growers, and creating sustainable food systems that need to serve everyone. And wheat is a rotation crop, and the price of the wheat flour, it's not the price of the flour that's the killer. It's less than $1 for a loaf of bread. I think it's labor more than anything. And yes, a bunch of industrial bread made on pennies, or that chart that we saw below, but that money isn't even going to the farmer. So I can't, it's not an easy question. It's a valid question, and I'm not sure, but I do feel like we need to impact the big. Oh yes, please.
Wait, before you guys jump in, let me, Glenn has something and Paul has something, but just mentioned that again tomorrow. Last year, the question came up: how can we do the artisan category? How can it be scaled to retain the quality of the skilled of the baker at the level of the mass market? This kind of is similar. How do we extend the quality of some of these new flours to the mass market? We'll be talking a little bit about scaling and going from craft to scale tomorrow in Marcus's talk. So we'll get into a little bit of that, but I think this is touching on, again, a theme that is important. And let me get Glenn first, because he's going to speak directly to this, and then Paul can.
Charlotte is a shining light for what you're asking for. The Noble Group has everything that Jennifer's been working for all these years. They actually are converted it into a fair food system. Drexel University has Valerie Irwin now, who used to have Geechee Girl Cafe. They actually are reaching into Philadelphia communities. Tufts is doing something right now. I just came from there yesterday. And there are many more. So what Jennifer is doing work with farmers. Once the farmers get together with bakers, they tend to hybrid these things in all fair food community works. And mentioning Arizona, the Hayden Mills Group, that's Chris Bianco and other folks involved in that. They've been doing fair trade with the tribes since the inception of that system. Okay? Yeah.
To the point of affordability for people of low income, I like to bring my helicopter up for a second and look at the fact that for those people there's a malnutrition problem, and it isn't that which their grandparents were facing, but it's the opposite. And what we have in artisan baking is, even if it's outpriced for them at this moment, it's an example of what they could be eating, and they can afford to eat that if they find, again, the lost joy of making it themselves. And I think that the work that you're doing, Jennifer, and above all, the making of the market for those growers, so that the growers can be encouraged to produce these grains nearby, make those grains available to consumers. Our work is to make those grains convertible into flour by the consumers, so they don't have to pay necessarily for the labor that goes into making the flour, and they don't have to pay for the labor that goes into making the bread. And everybody here who bakes knows the enormity of the joy of baking your own bread that you don't get from watching television, and you don't get from listening to music, and you don't get from a lot of other things. And so I think
Yeah.
that for me, that's the conscionable answer. Yes, we should make this fine bread, and yes, we should make a lot of noise about it so that society will recognize this opportunity for joy that's there, for simple family-building joy that our culture is proposing.
You know, I just want to add to that, because you touch on a really important piece. You know, diabetes, obesity. I mean, high glycemic index, roller milled industrial flour. I mean, it is not the solution to the problem. And I think that making, you know, these regional mills that have launched nationwide. I mean, this is not an easy undertaking. Trying to do what we're doing. There's a reason why mills are, you know, 200-300 times as big as our mill, or that might even be a small. I mean, you know, we process 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of grain a day. Your average size mill, I think I'm really understating to say 150,000 pounds a day. I think I'm really understating it. But anyways, the point is, you know, high glycemic index is, or this industrial white flour is not the solution. I personally, taking it to the small village is the one thing I do. Is I don't do deliveries, but I deliver to our co-op, and we get our flour into the bulk bins there, and people can buy their flour in our community cheaper than they could, like on our online store, because our online store, our retail online store, is there to kind of help subsidize the price to our bakers so we can keep our prices down. So that's like, you know, and then the one place I can get it to the individuals at an affordable thing is literally putting it in the back of my Prius and taking it to the co-op.
It's kind of like the old saying, think globally but act locally.
Yeah.
And it always starts local. Well, what final word from Stanley Ginsberg, and then we're going to break for lunch and hopefully keep this conversation going during lunch.
Yeah, I think this whole question of extending quality food down to lower income people, it really touches on a much broader problem, a much broader social problem, and that is the problem of education and the problem of recognition and awareness of self-interest. Because in fact, what we have now, we're dealing with this huge financial and economic juggernaut of big food that has a vested interest in profit margins that are tied to sugar, salt, and fat. And sugar, salt, and fat-rich foods are a lot more affordable. They're a lot more available. They are propagandized a lot more heavily and marketed a lot more aggressively, in particular in lower income areas. And I think that this thing has to start, you know, what we're really talking about is a much bigger question than what we're dealing with, you know, in this forum, because it involves a degree of social consciousness and social engagement that I think really has to spread.
But, you know,
it really has to expand through our society.
I will say your point, that is very, very relevant to the talk, Baker at the Helm, because I think after World War II, a lot of the, you know, during World War II, recipes changed because we didn't have, you know, butter in the coffers and all of that. And industry made that decision as to the direction of our pastries and the direction of our breads and all of that. And I'm saying, let's take that back and, you know, let the baker lead it. Thank you.
So, thank you. Yeah, I think, bigger problem than we can solve in this room, but we're not powerless, and that's why this is about the future of bread and what role does bread in its various levels
And
of
cookies.
milling, farming, and cookies. What does farmer, miller, baker? Where do we have some empowerment to be able to make a difference in the consciousness, which is another facet of what this gathering is all about.